I drove 9 hours with a crate of family heirlooms, only to hear the engagement dinner had been yesterday. I stood there, clutching that box, while their smiles treated me like some neighbour who wandered in without an invite. That night, I unfolded the map inside and realised perhaps it was never meant to be kept in the family. So I left, but what I chose afterward reshaped everything they believed they owned. The sky was just beginning to grey when I turned the key in the ignition. 9 long hours of highway unspooled ahead, and my back already ached at the thought. Yet I felt steady and filled with purpose. In the passenger seat, tucked into a wool blanket, sat a wooden box. Inside that box were 3 hand-drawn maps, each more than 70 years old. My grandfather had traced them by candlelight, one for each main route our family followed when we ran small freight lines out of southern Missouri. He passed them to my father, who passed them to me. I guarded them like breath. Today I planned to give them to my son. Miles always loved stories, loved hearing about our people and how they discovered paths no one else could find. When he was little, he would crawl onto my lap and trace those same maps with his small fingers, asking me to repeat where the river split, where the cotton once grew, where his great-grandfather camped. It had been a while since he'd asked for those stories. Still, today felt right. His engagement dinner, a milestone, a beginning, a moment to hand down what matters. I hadn't seen Miles in nearly 4 months. Our last call was quick, his voice rushed. He mentioned they were keeping it small, just family. I didn't press. I trusted him. I trusted my son. By the time I turned into the driveway, the sun had slipped behind a broad bank of clouds. The house looked newer than I remembered, larger, colder. Renee, his fiancée, opened the door. Her expression faltered a beat before she stepped aside. No hug, no welcome. I lifted the box. I said, "I brought something for the engagement dinner." She paused, tilted her head and said, "Oh, they had the dinner yesterday." I stood there a moment, box in hand. I asked what she meant. She shrugged, said it was last minute, that her family was in town, so it made sense. Then she smiled, thin as paper, and said they figured I wouldn't be up for the travel anyway. Inside, I could hear laughter. Someone tapped a glass. She never moved from the doorway. The box grew heavier in my arms. Not from weight, from shame. A shame that wasn't mine, but had somehow made a home on my shoulders. I asked if I could step in for just a moment. She glanced back, then said, "Maybe another time. We're still cleaning up. Too much going on." And the door closed. 9 hours of driving for that. I sat in the car for almost an hour. No one came out. Not Miles. Not even a text. Nothing. The box sat between us like a witness. I kept thinking about when he was 8, how he cried because I wouldn't let him draw on those maps. He called them treasure. I told him they were history. Maybe they were both. Now they were only mine again. Eventually I started the car and pulled away. There's a kind of silence that happens when someone shuts a door on you without a sound. It's louder than a shout. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't say a word. But the silence said everything. I drove until the highway stopped feeling cruel, until the fuel light blinked on, until I could hear my own breathing without choking on disappointment. That night, in a motel room, I opened the box. I spread the maps across the bed like old letters and traced the lines with my fingers again. I remembered every turn, every bend, every dotted trail. What my son had forgotten I still held, and right then something inside me began to shift. Have you ever felt it? That quiet moment when sadness thins and something steadier begins to settle. I felt it that night, and what I did the next morning, that part changes everything. The next morning, I drove back to my place in Blue Bluff. The sky was pale and thin, and the road hardly registered. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry, but the silence inside me had hardened overnight, not into a wall, more like a floor. I had somewhere to plant my feet. The house was still when I walked in. I've lived alone since Thomas passed, and the quiet used to sting. Not anymore. That morning, It felt like relief. I unpacked the maps and placed them back in the cabinet drawer, just beneath the hand-carved compass I used on my father's land runs. That drawer had always been where legacy lived, but something in me knew the maps wouldn't stay there much longer. Around noon, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table. I kept seeing Miles's face the day he got into college, how he leaned on me like I was his gravity. That boy hadn't returned my call, not even a message. A full day had gone by. I picked up the envelope at the edge of the table. It had arrived 2 weeks earlier from a regional museum I used to work with. They'd invited me for years to come back and help catalogue historic trade maps. I always declined, but this time the envelope included a note from the director, Sylvia Lannister. She'd heard I was keeping rare family artefacts. She wondered if I might consider curating them for public view. I hadn't responded. It felt like too much then, too tender. But I opened the letter again, reread every line, then read it once more. Something had shifted that morning. Miles's silence didn't just hurt. It clarified. I called Sylvia. She picked up on the second ring, surprised but warm. She always was. We hadn't spoken in almost a year. I told her I was reconsidering her offer, that I had 3 maps from the early 1900s with first-hand annotations, trade routes, route notes in my grandfather's hand, and that I was ready to let them live beyond my house. She didn't rush me. She simply said they had room, and if I wanted to bring them myself, they'd be honoured. After we hung up, I sat in the living room and stared at the fireplace. No flames, just cold stone. The kind that doesn't heat a room, only witnesses one. It wasn't only about the maps. It was about how my life had quietly shrunk around my son's needs without my noticing. The dinners I cooked when he didn't show. The birthdays I sat through while Renee's family took the spotlight. The $12,000 I loaned them when they launched that real estate firm, and how I never mentioned it again. Because I believed in him, because that's what we do for those we love. That love had gone quiet, not because I stopped feeling it, but because he stopped receiving it. A week later, I visited the museum. The moment I stepped into the curation wing, the air felt different, clean, deliberate. Tables with gloves and magnifiers, walls lined with artifacts, volunteers moving with quiet purpose. No one here was pretending to care. They were here because they already did. Sylvia greeted me with a long hug. No questions, just a gentle hand guiding me to a room labelled Private Collection Intake. Inside, I laid out the maps. I watched her trace the edges with reverence. Not a single word about price. Not a single word about dollars, only worth in time, story, people. She asked if I'd be willing to record a short history, something for the display, maybe speak with their interns. I said yes before I could second-guess it. Driving home that evening, the town felt warmer. Same buildings, same trees, yet I saw them differently, as if a film had been lifted from my eyes. Back at home, I cleared the cabinet drawer. I didn't leave it empty. I set a small brass key inside, the key that once opened my father's cedar chest. The chest was long gone, but I'd kept the key. I didn't know why until that moment. It was the last piece of his I hadn't shared. Now I understood. Some things belong to blood, some belong to memory. But some, maps, stories, a silence broken at the right time, belong to legacy. And I was done entrusting that legacy to people who didn't want to carry it. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in years I wanted to find out. The next morning, taking out the trash, I passed the corkboard by the fridge. For years it held old birthday cards, neighbour notes and photos of Miles through every age. First day of kindergarten, senior prom. That Idaho summer he came home sunburned and grinning. What stopped me was the newest photo I'd pinned. Last year's Thanksgiving, when I visited Miles and Renee. We'd gone to the local arboretum, and a stranger offered to take our picture. Renee wore a deep green scarf. Miles rested a hand gently on her back. I stood beside them smiling. The photo had been cut straight down the middle. Renee and Miles remained intact. My half was neatly sliced out. I stared for a long time, not shocked, just recognizing. There's a way a person gets erased from their own life, and the first signs aren't loud. They're subtle. Your seat moved without mention. Your stories retold without credit. Your memories edited until they suit someone else's comfort. I took the photo down, folded it once, and slipped it into a recipe book. I had no appetite to throw it away, not yet. Later that afternoon, I mailed a small parcel to the museum. Sylvia had requested a copy of a journal my grandfather kept during his freight years. The postal clerk, Sandra, a woman I've known 20 years, smiled and asked how Miles was. I smiled back and said he was busy. Then I paused and asked if she had time for coffee this week. She looked surprised and nodded. That was the first time I admitted I didn't want to explain this away. I just didn't want to carry it alone anymore. 3 days later, I met Sandra at the diner off the old town square. She wore a rust-coloured cardigan and brought a warmth that never hurried. We sat near the window where the light softened everything. I didn't tell her all of it, just enough. She listened. No quick pity, no empty words, only nods. Then she said something I didn't expect. It had happened to her too. Her daughter married into money and slowly drifted. Fewer calls, no visits. Then one Christmas, Sandra saw a photo online, the whole family in front of the tree. She wasn't in it. She had hosted that year. She'd cooked, cleaned, paid for most of it, and still didn't belong. We sat in silence. Then she said grief isn't always about death. Sometimes it's about still being alive while someone chooses to forget you. That line stayed with me. When I got home that evening, an envelope waited between the screen and the doorframe. No return address. My name, familiar handwriting. Inside, a wedding invitation. Miles and Renee. 2 months from now in Oregon. No note, just the card, crisp and white. At the bottom, in tiny print, ceremony only, no reception. I stared at it for a long time. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was precision. I hadn't been told about the engagement dinner. Now I was invited to a wedding where there was no seat for me at the table. And still I didn't shatter. I clarified. I pulled a box from the hallway closet. Receipts, old printed emails. A slim binder labelled Family Finances. I'd started it when Thomas got sick, so Miles would know where things stood. Page after page, I reviewed what I'd given him over the years. 2 loans. First, $12,000 to start their first flip. Second, $27,000 when they fell behind on property tax and nearly lost the Flagstaff place. Both unpaid, both undocumented, because I trusted him. At the bottom of the stack, a copy of the title transfer for the lakeside cabin we owned. Thomas and I had signed it over to Miles 5 years ago, believing he'd preserve it. They sold it 8 months later, used the money to invest in a renovation in Austin. I found out from a friend at the county office. I never said a word until now. I pulled a fresh folder and began organising, not to fight, but because I was finished forgetting, finished pretending, finished letting others narrate my life. By the time I stopped, the sun had dipped behind the pines. The kitchen was quiet again, but this time not hollow. It was focused. Something in me had started to wake. Not anger, not revenge, clarity. The calm drumbeat of a woman finally writing her own name back into the story, even if she had to begin in the margins. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Not rested, restless. A quiet tension hummed under my skin, as if something waited to be noticed. The house was still. Coffee dripped as the sun struggled behind grey clouds. I sat in the kitchen staring at nothing until my eyes caught the utility closet. It wasn't just a place for bulbs and old tools. It was where I kept things no one else thought to ask about. I opened it slowly. My hand found the safe in the back, the one Harold and I bought after we sold our first plot. Not fancy, but ours, and somehow more trustworthy than any bank. It took a second to recall the combination, but my fingers didn't hesitate. Inside were manila folders thick with paper, some dusty, some crisp. One stood out, a small folder labelled Catskills. I opened it. Deeds. Handwritten notes. The cabin Harold and I bought upstate after my mother died. Modest, yes, but it mattered. A refuge, mine, paid in full with my inheritance. Then I saw it. A fresh page stapled to the back. A transfer of title. The property moved into an LLC. Not just any name, Mile Wren Development Holdings. My hand stilled. My eyes did not. I read every word. Date. April of last year. Signatures. Witnesses. A notary I'd never met. And nowhere was there my signature. They had taken it without a word, without asking. I didn't cry, not then. I sat back and stared at the safe, at what else might be buried in those stacks. The shock ran deep, but under it something else rose. I needed someone to confirm I wasn't imagining this, someone who understood these documents better than I ever could. By noon, I was dressed and driving. I didn't call Miles, I didn't text. I passed the square and parked under the faded green awning of Connolly and Hartman. I remembered June Connolly. Her daughter Meredith runs it now. The receptionist was young, polite, surprised to see me. Within minutes, Meredith shook my hand and led me to her office. No small talk. She waited. I told her everything, from the doorstep to the sliced-in-half photo, from the dinner I wasn't told about to the deed shifted without my knowledge. She asked for the papers. I handed them over. Meredith read in silence. Her face stayed calm, but her eyes darkened. When she finished, she leaned back. She'd seen this before. Not the exact shape, but the same pattern. Quiet paperwork, unnoticed powers of attorney. Parents signed off assets they didn't fully understand. Properties moved into holding companies that quietly edged the original owner out. I asked what could be done. She said she'd start with the LLC, who formed it, when and whether my name had been used anywhere. She'd also search for any recent legal filings in my name. Powers of attorney, estate changes, anything suspicious. I left with a file folder and her card. She told me not to speak to Miles or Renee until we knew more. I nodded. Back home, I pulled every document from the safe and locked them in a briefcase, then put the case in my trunk, just in case. I called my accountant, my insurance agent. I asked questions I should have asked years ago. That evening, I sat on the porch looking out over the lake. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I felt clear, and that clarity weighed more than anything. For the first time in years, I saw my life as it was, not what I hoped, not what I thought I'd built. I had trusted too much. I had let silence speak for me. I had allowed people I loved to make decisions for me, without ever questioning their motives. Not anymore. That night I climbed to the attic and found a box I hadn't opened in years. Letters, a map. A key to the Catskills cabin, the one I never thought I'd need again. I traced the map with my finger. The roads looked thinner than I remembered, but I still knew them. I could still find my way. My house no longer felt like home. But I wasn't lost. They thought they'd moved me off the board. I was just getting started. The days that followed were oddly quiet, like the hush after a long storm no one wants to name. Renee and Miles seemed to read my silence as resolution, maybe even surrender. But I wasn't quiet because I was passive. I was quiet because I was watching. Their tone toward me settled into something cold and transactional. I wasn't invited for coffee. I wasn't included on calls with the wedding planner. Even the dog, Finn, stopped curling at my feet and started sleeping by their door. I didn't try to change it. I used the time to sort the rest of the papers, labelling folders, old investments, bonds, land certificates. In one worn envelope I found something I didn't expect. Harold's last letter to me. Blue ink. Dated 3 weeks before he died. I remembered how he set it on my bedside table and told me not to open it until I needed to hear his voice again. He wrote about the cabin, about how I always lit the fire just before the sun dropped behind the hills, about the summer we painted the shutters green and danced barefoot on the porch afterward. Near the end his tone shifted. People, even the ones we love, can lose sight when money or power creeps in, he warned. Don't doubt your instincts. And then the line that mattered most. You are the steward of what we built. Protect it, even if that means walking away from those who don't deserve it. I folded the letter, slid it into my coat pocket, and sat in the kitchen stillness, listening to the clock count down the moments before everything changed. The next morning, Meredith called. She'd looked deeper into Mile Wren Development Holdings. The LLC formed 5 months before I arrived, using a P.O. box in a nearby town. Signatory Miles, manager, Renee, my name nowhere. Worse, she discovered the cabin had been pledged as collateral on a short-term business loan, leveraged for a down payment on a property I'd never heard of, tied to a restaurant venture already wobbling. I didn't react right away. My hands went numb, not from shock but from confirmation. They had gambled something sacred, something meant to outlast both of us, and never even bothered to tell me. Not only did they hide it, they used my trust as a springboard to reach farther than they ever should have. That evening, Renee stood at the stove, rosemary and lemon in the air. Miles scrolled emails at the dining table. I walked in carrying a box of framed photos I'd taken down from the upstairs hallway, birthdays, vacations, cookouts. They all shared one thing, my face. I set the box on the table. They looked up. No one spoke. I kept my voice even. I told them I'd be taking a short trip upstate. I didn't elaborate. I didn't invite questions. I simply said I needed time away. Renee asked if I'd be back for the wedding weekend. I said we'd talk when I returned. I packed that night. 1 bag, 2 warm outfits, the briefcase with every legal and financial record, and Harold's letter. I left before sunrise. I didn't leave a note. I didn't look back. The roads toward the Catskills felt narrower than I remembered, but my hands moved with a certainty I hadn't felt in years. The trees had just begun to turn. Cool air slipped in through the cracked window. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly as it had decades ago, weathered but sturdy. The porch creaked beneath my steps. I unlocked the door and let the dust greet me like an old friend. Inside, I lit a fire, opened the windows and breathed. For hours there was nothing but silence and the warmth of the hearth, a peace you only recognize after starving for it. I slept better that night than I had in months. In the morning, I brewed tea and walked to the mailbox at the end of the gravel path. I left a letter addressed to Meredith, copies of everything, the deed transfer, the LLC filing, Harold's letter, and a note from me. I asked her to file a formal complaint, to prepare the documents to challenge the legitimacy of the transfer, to act not just as my attorney, but as a witness to what I was reclaiming. Because this wasn't about land or money. It was older and more fragile. It was dignity, and I was done giving mine away. I returned to the city 3 days later, not because I missed them, but because I was ready. The cabin had done its work. It reminded me who I was before I became someone's safety net, before I was someone to be tolerated, manoeuvred around, forgotten at the very table I once built. That fire did more than heat the room. It woke me. Back at the house, Renee didn't lift her eyes when I walked in. Miles muttered a hello without looking up from his laptop. Their lives had kept going. Mine had simply exited. That suited me fine. I went upstairs, opened my closet, and took out the travel bag. Inside was a single folder, thick with copies and notes and the weight of proof. I photographed every page and sent them to Meredith. Then I sat at the edge of my bed, closed my eyes and breathed. That night I didn't cook. I didn't ask what they needed. I didn't speak unless spoken to. The shift confused them. I could tell. But they didn't press. They were still too sure of themselves. A week passed. Meredith called with an update. She had filed a petition to challenge the property transfer. Since the LLC was created with concealed intent, and I'd never been informed or given consent, there was ground to investigate fraudulent conveyance. The house was mine again in the eyes of the law, temporarily, pending the full inquiry. Even that small recognition settled something in me. I didn't tell them immediately. I watched. I noticed how Renee took over the garden patio, calling it her design project, How Miles brought in catalogues for luxury fixtures we'd never needed. No mention of the cabin, no whisper of the LLC, but attention threaded their movements, as if they knew something was about to snap. It did the morning a courier arrived with a large envelope addressed to me. Renee picked it up, glanced at the name and set it in front of me while I drank my coffee. I opened it slowly, feeling her eyes. Inside was a formal letter from the county recorder, acknowledging receipt of my claim and confirming the property was now under legal review. Renee paled. She asked where it came from. I didn't answer. Miles walked in. She handed him the letter. He scanned it, then looked at me. His face didn't flush, it fell. He asked what I was doing. I didn't respond. I took the letter and walked to the sunroom. Hours later, they asked to talk. We sat in the living room. Miles did most of it, said things had gotten complicated, that they only wanted to help the family's future. He mentioned the restaurant investment, expansion, timing. He insisted it wasn't about taking anything from me. I nodded. Then I asked why he never told me about the LLC, why he forged my name on the deed, why he used the cabin, the place Harold and I built, as collateral for a loan I'd never seen. He didn't answer. Renee tried to step in. It was a misunderstanding. I was always going to benefit. It would stay in the family. I told her I'd read Harold's letter again, his words about stewardship and protection, and the line that mattered most. You don't protect something by handing it to people who lie. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I told them I'd regained legal control of the property, and if they needed to find a new place, I would give them 60 days, out of decency. Miles stared at the floor. Renee stared at me. Neither spoke. And in that quiet, something unlatched in my chest. Not relief, not triumph, certainty. They believed they were building something grand, never realizing they'd cracked the foundation first. I had simply taken back the ground under their feet. The rest of the story would follow. The 60 days slid past like a train ghosting through fog, quiet, steady, inevitable. I never once had to ask whether they were packing. By the 3rd week, boxes gathered at the foot of the stairs like muted confessions. Renee's garden tools vanished from the patio by the 5th. By the 6th, the clatter of Miles's espresso machine fell silent. They moved as though afraid to rattle something delicate, as if quiet might make the truth less solid. I didn't gloat. I didn't prod. I didn't remind them. I kept to my rhythm the way I always had. Early coffee, worn books, short loops around the neighbourhood. The air in the house changed. Not tense, just hollow. Sometimes the walls seemed to breathe again, relieved to be spared the performance. At times I caught Miles looking at me, like he wanted to form a sentence but had misplaced the words. Renee avoided me entirely. We shared rooms where nothing was said and everything was understood. On the 32nd day, Meredith called. She'd just stepped out of a conference with a real estate attorney her firm trusted. He had pored over everything, and his first words to her were, "This wasn't a mistake. This was a long plan." The LLC, he said, had been set up more than 14 months earlier. Miles had filed it under a different name. His best friend appeared as the registered agent. Renee's cousin, the one who always lingered too long at holidays, had signed as a witness. Every thread tied back to them. They had taken their time, moved slowly, waited for Harold to die, waited for my grief to quiet, waited for the dust to settle. I wasn't simply collateral. I was the last piece they meant to slide off the board. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Meredith on speaker. She read through a draft affidavit. Her voice stayed calm, but there was a fine edge of anger beneath it. We could petition to reclaim full control of the LLC's assets and unwind the fraudulent conveyance. Not only did we have grounds to recover the property, we could pursue punitive damages. I thanked her, hung up, and stared into the dark window over the sink until my reflection looked back, older, yes, but no longer afraid. I touched the cool glass and felt, for the first time in a long while, that the surface would not swallow me. By day 42, Miles asked to speak with me in private. We sat in the sunroom, the same spot where Harold used to nap with the Sunday paper open across his chest. Miles cleared his throat and fussed with his watch. He said he hadn't meant for things to go so far. He thought he could manage it better than I could. The family needed someone to take charge. I listened. He talked about investments, market headwinds, property taxes. I listened. Then he said the line that froze the room. "You don't even use it, Mum, the cabin. You sit in this house and you mourn." I looked at him for a long while. Then I told him about the weekend I spent there alone, about the old log where Harold carved our initials, the way the trees still creaked like they did 30 years ago, the letter I found, and the feeling that slid into place when I realised my name still mattered somewhere. He offered no reply. I stood, stepped to the mantel and lifted a framed photo. Thanksgiving 12 years ago, our last with Harold. Miles had an arm around me. Renee was smiling. It looked warm, genuine, but the woman in the picture knew nothing about what silence can conceal. I handed the frame to him. "This," I said, "is what I thought we were protecting." I left the room without turning back. By day 54, they had packed their last of their belongings. Renee didn't say goodbye. She left a note on the kitchen counter, thanking me for letting them stay as long as they had. She said she hoped I might forgive her one day. The handwriting was careful, almost childlike. Miles was the last to close the door. He paused on the threshold, swept his eyes around the house one final time, then turned to me. "I didn't know what I was becoming," he said. I nodded, then I shut the door, and for the first time in months I turned the lock. The click sounded small and absolute, like a period at the end of a long sentence. That evening, I wandered out to the backyard, eased myself onto the old wooden swing Harold built, and let the night wind slide through the trees. The silence that wrapped around me felt different now, no longer hollow, no longer heavy. It was mine again. 2 weeks after Miles and Renee left, the house began to sound alive in a new way. Not quieter, fuller. The quiet had rhythm, the steady tick of Harold's clock, which I'd wound again. The shuffle of squirrels across the porch roof each morning. I had space once more, space not haunted by tension or apology. I began reclaiming corners of the house that had gathered dust for years. The sewing room, not for stitching, but for sorting old letters and clippings I had always meant to organise. The attic, where Harold's war journals waited, still untouched. Even the basement pantry, lined with jars of pickled green beans and tomato sauce, some surely long past safe to eat but sealed with memory. For a while, peace held steady, gentle and surprising. Then, late on a Thursday morning, came the knock. I wasn't expecting anyone. I thought it might be a delivery, a package left by the post. But when I opened the door, there was no parcel, only Gwen, Harold's cousin. We hadn't spoken since the funeral. She stood on the porch wrapped in a long tan coat, silver-grey hair clipped back. She looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, but her eyes hadn't dimmed. They were sharp, alert, full of purpose. I stepped aside without speaking and let her in. She didn't sit. She stood at the centre of the living room, gaze sweeping slowly over the walls, over the fireplace, over me. Then she said, "You know, I always liked you better than your sister-in-law." I gave a small, dry laugh. Then she got to the point. She said she'd heard about the LLC, about the property transfer, and that Harold had come to her before he passed. "He was worried," she said. "Worried Miles might try something. He wanted to make sure you stayed protected." My knees softened. I sank into a chair. Gwen reached into her coat and drew out a slim envelope. "He gave me this," she said. "Told me to hold it until it felt like the right time." I stared at it. The handwriting on the front was Harold's, neat, squared letters, steady even in age. She placed it into my hands, patted my shoulder once and turned toward the door. "That's all I came to do," she said softly. "He'd want you to have it now." Then she was gone. I didn't open the envelope right away. I sat holding it, feeling the faint weight of it, the way it carried more than paper. When I finally slid my finger under the seal, I read it once, then again slower. Harold had created a second trust. Not for Miles, not for the grandchildren, for me. He had transferred the cabin back into my name 2 months before he passed. Quietly, legally, completely. The LLC Miles had formed had never truly owned it. Their paperwork, their transfers, their notarized signatures, all built on a lie. Harold's signature on their copy of the deed was a reproduction, not the original. What Miles and Renee had tried to sell was a mirage. The land was still mine. My pulse hammered as I read the last line. In case you ever need to remember who built this life with you, it was never them. It was us. I sat there for a long while, staring out through the window at the trees, breathing slow and deep, my chest tight but not with grief this time, with an unexpected rush of calm, of affirmation. By the next morning I had called Meredith. I told her everything Gwen had said, and scanned Harold's letter to send over. She didn't even try to hide her reaction. "This changes everything," she said. Within days the legal gears began to shift. The lawyer who had notarized Harold's original documents confirmed their authenticity. The second trust was binding. Miles's supposed sale of the property to an out-of-state investor was collapsing in real time. The title company had already flagged inconsistencies and halted the final transfer of funds. I could almost hear the walls closing in on them, but there was no joy in me, only sorrow deep and clean. Not because I doubted the outcome, but because I could finally see how far we had all drifted, how ready they had been to erase me for something they couldn't even hold on to. A week later, I drove to the cabin alone. Autumn had settled in, the air crisp and honeyed, the leaves crunching beneath my boots as I followed the same trail Harold used to clear each spring. The cabin looked the same, worn but strong, windows clouded, porch sagging slightly at one corner. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled of pine, cedar, and the faint ghost of time. I placed Harold's letter on the kitchen table, made tea, and waited for the kettle to whistle. That night I sat on the porch wrapped in Harold's old flannel blanket, watching stars bloom in the black sky. The silence was not empty, it was sacred. The wind whispered through the trees like breath through prayer. And I understood then. This wasn't the ending. This was the beginning of the part of my life where I no longer apologized for surviving. The part where I stopped shrinking to make room for those who never offered me space. The part where I reclaimed not just the land, but myself. The call from Miles came on a Sunday evening, just as dusk was fading to a bruised violet over the lake. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting Harold's old photo albums into 2 stacks. Those I wanted to keep close and those I was finally ready to store away. When my phone buzzed, his name appeared on the screen, familiar and foreign all at once. For a few long seconds, I only stared at it, tracing the glow of the letters like they belonged to someone I used to know. When I finally answered, he didn't say hello. He simply said, "We'd like to invite you to dinner." No explanation, no apology, just that. He mentioned Renee would cook, that they wanted to talk, to clear the air. He said it the way someone reads a script they don't fully understand. I didn't ask questions. I just said yes, because I needed to look them in the eye. The night of the dinner, I wore the navy dress Harold had always loved, the one he said made the blue in my eyes brighter. I didn't put it on for them. I wore it to remind myself who I was before the silence. When I pulled into their driveway, the porch lights glared too bright, and through the window I could see everything too tidy, too deliberate. The house smelled of lemon and lavender when Renee opened the door. It was a smell that tried too hard to say everything's fine. The table was already set when I walked in, cloth napkins folded sharp, her best china laid out, glasses that had never seen a weekday. Renee greeted me with a thin, professional smile. Miles stood behind her, looking hollowed out, his posture slouched but his jaw locked tight. The first few minutes passed in meaningless chatter. The weather, the neighbours, a new Pilates class, the kind of conversation people use to drown out what's really sitting in the room with them. Dinner was pleasant in the way a waiting room is pleasant, sterile, controlled. The food tasted fine, though I barely registered it. I ate slowly, deliberately, letting the quiet do what it wanted. Finally, Miles exhaled and said, "It's been a rough couple of weeks. The cabin deal fell through. The buyer backed out. There are lawyers involved. It's stressful." He didn't meet my eyes, but he didn't have to. I nodded once. Then came the part he thought was generosity. "We just want to move forward," he said, "to put this behind us, as a family." It was Renee who added, "You're still welcome here." She said it like she was offering a gift. I set my fork down carefully and folded my hands. "That's kind," I said softly, "but I brought something with me." From my bag I drew an envelope, crisp, thick, deliberate, and slid it across the table. Not Harold's letter. This one contained the legal filing Meredith had submitted that very morning, the one officially freezing all assets tied to Mile Wren Development Holdings. Renee didn't touch it. Miles hesitated, then picked it up, scanning the first page, then the second. His face blanched, his lips parted. "This isn't necessary," he muttered. I didn't answer. Renee's tone cut the air next. "You're being dramatic." That made me smile, small, unflinching. "Dramatic," I repeated. "I spent 35 years beside Harold, building this family, keeping it together. And in one afternoon, you both decided I was disposable. I took a sip of water. You sold something that wasn't yours. You lied to do it, and then you left me standing in the cold like I was a stranger." I leaned back in my chair. "So no, this isn't about drama. It's about boundaries, about consequences." Miles opened his mouth, then closed it again, his throat working but no words coming. I let the silence stretch between us until it hummed. Then I said the part I came to say. "You will no longer have access to any of my accounts. Every document, power of attorney, trust, estate has been rewritten. Your names are no longer there." The colour drained from Renee's face. The air in the room seemed to thin. The polite mask she wore cracked at the edges. I went on, calm but firm. "I'm not doing this out of anger. I'm doing it because peace has a price, and this is mine." I stood, smoothed my dress and nodded once. "Dinner was lovely." "Thank you." Neither of them moved. No words followed me down the hall. I let myself out and closed the door behind me. In the car I sat for a moment, my hands steady on the steering wheel. The night air tasted clean, unburdened. I turned the key, drove home and brewed a cup of tea. I lit a candle on the porch, opened Harold's letter again, not to reread it, but to feel it. I slept soundly that night, the kind of sleep that comes when there's nothing left to defend. Only silence. Full, sacred silence. A week passed after that dinner. No calls, no messages, no apology. But I didn't need one. Instead, I turned my attention to what came next. The vision Harold and I once whispered about in the soft hours before dawn, when his breath had already grown shallow and he spoke only truth. "We should build something," he had said. "Something that lasts longer than any of this. Longer than land. Longer than names." At the time I thought he meant the cabin. Maybe he meant something bigger. So I started spending my mornings at the town library. Not in the fiction aisles where I used to linger, but downstairs in the little basement room where community notices curled under thumbtacks and ideas waited quietly for someone to notice them. I brought a folder Meredith helped me put together, notes, legal frameworks, non-profit templates. I spread them on the table and stared until the words blurred, and I started seeing faces instead. Older women. Women like me. Women who had worked, given, been erased by the very families they'd held up. I thought of Carol, the nurse from down the street, whose kids sold her car and moved her into an apartment far from everyone she knew. Of Susan, who had signed her retirement annuity over to her daughter, thinking it was a refinance, and lost her home in the process. I remembered their voices in grocery aisles, the tired laughter that meant we survive because no one sees us, so I did it. I filed the paperwork, the Lena Foundation, named for my grandmother, who raised 5 children after the war and never once complained, even when she had every right to. The mission was simple: to educate and empower women over 60 who had faced manipulation, financial, emotional, or both, from the people closest to them. To give them legal guidance, practical tools, and community. Meredith introduced me to a retired accountant named June, who'd been pushed out of her own firm by her sons. She had sharp eyes and zero patience for pity. Then came Ellie, a widowed real estate broker, who'd lost her home when her stepson forged her signature on a loan. Together, we found a small office near the bus station, easy to reach, simple, honest. Word spread quietly. First a nod from an older woman at the diner, then folded notes slipped into my coat pocket at church. Handwritten letters with no return address, short, raw, brave. I read them all. One was from a woman named Judith. "I gave them everything," she wrote, "and now they tell me I imagined it all. I don't need much. I just want to feel like I exist." I carried her words with me for days. We hosted our first workshop on a rainy Saturday. I bought muffins from the market and brewed coffee in a borrowed percolator. 6 women came. One cried before we even began. Another brought a stack of unopened bills, trembling hands clutching them like proof of survival. I didn't stand behind a podium. I sat with them eye to eye. I told enough of my story, not all, just enough for them to see I wasn't above them. I was beside them. At the end, one woman lingered behind. She wore a burgundy coat and held a small photograph of herself laughing in the snow with her late husband. She said quietly, "I haven't laughed like that in years." Then she looked up. But today came close. That night I walked home in the cold rain, shoes soaked, fingers numb, but my heart steady. The kind of steady that doesn't come from applause, but from truth lived out loud. The next morning, Meredith called. The court had ruled in our favour. Miles's LLC dissolved. The assets returned. The cabin, finally irrevocably mine. I thanked her. Then I said what I hadn't been able to before. Winning isn't the point anymore, I told her. This is the women, the ripple, the foundation, the life beginning again, built not from inheritance but from intention. The local paper ran a small feature on the Lena Foundation the following week. A columnist named Bryn had quietly attended one of our Saturday sessions. She had asked permission to sit in the back of the room, notebook balanced on her knee. She barely took notes, only watched, observant still. I assumed it was for a short community column, maybe a paragraph at most. But when the paper came out that Thursday morning, there it was. A full-page piece titled Voices That Return. It wasn't loud or sensational. It was delicate, deliberate, about women rediscovering their own strength after being dismissed, disbelieved, or discarded. Bryn didn't print names. She didn't have to. Her words carried our essence better than any of us could have said it ourselves. The article spread faster than I expected. At the market, 2 strangers nodded to me. At church, 3 women stopped to ask how they could volunteer. 2 days later, the phone rang at the foundation office. A woman's voice introduced herself as Michelle Everett, a program director for the local PBS affiliate. She said she had read the article and wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak at their upcoming Women's Legacy Night. I hesitated. For months, everything I'd built had lived in quiet corners, library basements, folded notes, borrowed coffee pots. A stage felt like something foreign, but Michelle's voice carried a kind conviction. "Your story could help others," she said simply. I took a breath and said yes. The event was held at the old theatre downtown, the one with velvet seats worn thin from decades of hands and hearts. When I arrived, I almost turned around. Not because of fear, but because the crowd, the stage lights, the sound of microphone checks. It all felt so much larger than the spaces where healing usually happens. But then I saw Meredith waiting near the entrance, her deep green dress catching the stage glow. She smiled, steady and proud, and that was enough to keep my feet moving. They gave me 8 minutes. I didn't read from notes. I spoke the way I've always told stories, slowly, like setting a table for someone I loved. I talked about the land Harold and I had kept for 40 years, the silence that swallowed me after he died, the mistake of thinking love guaranteed loyalty, and the day I looked across a table and realised my son no longer saw me as his mother, but as a stepping stone. But more than any of that, I spoke about what came after, the rebuilding that wasn't revenge but renewal, the women, the foundation, the ripple. When I stepped off the stage, the applause didn't crash like thunder. It rose in soft, steady waves, the kind of clapping that feels like breathing. That reminds you people are listening not because they pity you, but because they recognise themselves. I didn't search for faces in the crowd. I simply returned to my seat and sat still, heart full and quiet. Something had shifted that night. The following Monday, a letter arrived at the foundation. Plain envelope, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper, Miles's handwriting. It was brief, clipped, emotionless. He wrote, "I saw the broadcast. I hope you'll refrain from discussing private family matters in public forums. If this continues, I may have to consider legal action." I didn't reply. I didn't even feel the need to. That same afternoon, Judith arrived early for the session. She brought a small basket of lavender muffins and set them on the table without saying a word. As we waited for the others, she leaned closer. "I saw you on TV," she said, her voice trembling. For the first time in years, I believed I still mattered. I didn't speak. I just reached for her hand and held it, warm, still human. Later that evening, walking home past the darkened storefronts, I passed the old building where Meredith used to work before she started her own practice. The windows reflected my image back at me, older, lined, tired perhaps, but whole. Not the woman bent by grief. Not the mother erased by silence. Just me. That was when I realised something vital. I had already won, not in court. Not in headlines. But in every letter slipped under our door, in every tear that fell onto our coffee-stained table, in every woman who walked through that office unsure and left standing taller. The final exchange had already happened. They took the land. I gave away the legacy, and in return I received something untouchable, a life unapologetic, unedited, unclaimed, and no threat, no silence. No letter could ever take that back. The next morning, the light through my kitchen window didn't look any different, but I did. It wasn't revelation, just stillness. For the first time in years, I woke without a list of things to fix, people to protect, or silence to swallow. I simply got up, made tea, and wrapped myself in Harold's cardigan. Outside, the trees had begun to shift early, reds and golds tumbling through the wind like small promises of change. The porch boards creaked softly beneath my feet, a familiar song. There had been no response to Miles's letter, and I knew there wouldn't be. I had nothing left to defend. What I had instead was a waiting room full of women by 10 o'clock, each carrying her own version of my story. Some louder, some buried deeper. They came with notebooks and paper cups of coffee, with weary eyes and cautious hope. They didn't come to hear my story. They came to remember their own, and that, I realised, was the point all along. The last time I saw Miles wasn't on a stand or in a headline. It was in the grocery store parking lot 3 weeks after the PBS event. He looked smaller, thinner. Not ill, just reduced somehow. Our eyes met across the rows of cars. I nodded once. He looked away. That was all. No words. No apologies. Just space. Sometimes silence isn't punishment. It's a sentence. Later that week, I visited Harold's grave. I hadn't been there in months, not out of anger, but because I no longer needed to speak to the stone to feel him near. I brought a sunflower from the foundation garden and tucked it into the grass. Then I stood there quietly, eyes closed, letting everything go. The court filings, the years of quiet endurance, the ache of wanting to be seen. Letting go doesn't always feel like freedom. Sometimes it feels like grief finding its way home. But as I stood there under that grey sky, I realised I wasn't bitter. I wasn't even sad. I was simply me, a woman with stories etched into her skin, lines of laughter and loss, and a quiet victory beating steady in her chest. That night, after locking up the foundation, I took the long walk home through the cool streets. I didn't need company. I didn't need recognition. I already had what I came for, peace. Not the kind that comes from winning, but the kind that blooms when you stop needing to. They thought they could erase me from the will, from the home, from memory. But I had rewritten myself into something they could never touch. Legacy isn't what you hide in a vault. It's what you leave in people, and mine was just beginning. If you've ever felt like your voice was pressed aside, like your worth depended on someone else's permission, I want you to hold this story a little longer. Ask yourself, what would it look like to reclaim your peace without asking? If this story stirred something in you, you're not alone. Share your thoughts below. Someone out there might need your words tonight. Let's keep the conversation alive, for every woman rebuilding quietly, just like Lena.